A new version of LibreOffice is released. Winepak makes it easier for you to run your Windows programs on Linux. The failure of the Linux desktop. Has it been a good thing for Linux in the grand scheme of things? 5 reasons why i3 is better than your current desktop environment, and Snapchat's their source code was hacked and leaked online. It was archived on GitHub. These are 5 stories that I will be taking into account. And the first story on the docket today is LibreOffice. A new version of LibreOffice has been released with some pretty major changes and user interface tweaks over at OMG Ubuntu, and I will of course link to the article in the show descriptions. They recently published this particular story. LibreOffice 6.1 released with major changes. The open source Office suite once again delivers. Some of the changes mentioned, let's see, you can now download LibreOffice 6.1, the latest stable release of the super popular open source Office suite, yada yada yada. 6.1 is in a lot of repos. Certainly if you guys are on rolling release distros, 6.1 should already be available for you. This is billed as a major release. That is what the LibreOffice folks are calling 6.1, a major release, instead of, your typical minor releases, which are mainly bug fixes, just fixing some stuff that's broken. This one, again, is a major release because it introduces new features. Some of the new features include, of course, interface tweaks, improved documentation and help, and it's said to be more compatible with Microsoft Office files than ever before. That is a big plus. One of the biggest complaints from people trying to make the switch to Linux is when we tell them LibreOffice is Microsoft Office compatible. That is not entirely true. It is not 100% compatible with everything that Microsoft Office does, but it's pretty close, and apparently it's getting even closer now with LibreOffice 6.1. So you import your Microsoft Word files over to the LibreOffice writer. Hopefully everything works, the formatting's correct, the same thing with the presentation software, the spreadsheet software. As a major open source project, LibreOffice is the project of community code contributors collaborating together, yada 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 yada. It's an open source project. In fact, probably one of the most popular open source programs on the planet. It's hard to say what's the most popular. LibreOffice, though, is an extremely popular program. Hundreds of millions of people use LibreOffice. It is one of the very best free and open source projects on the planet, right alongside things like Firefox, hundreds of millions of users. Let's see, some of the major changes that they're touting in this release: new icon themes. Does that matter too much? Well, you know what? Appearance does matter. And you know what? I like the fact that they, in the Linux versions, this will be a little bit different in the Windows versions. The Linux versions used to use a icon set called Tango. You see the Tango icon set in the top. Now they're switching over to the elementary icons, the blue elementary icon set, which is a really attractive icon set. So that will now be their default icon set in LibreOffice. Now, for those of you on Windows, a new icon set is planned for that. Instead of using the old icon set, which also was Tango, they're going to use Colibre is the name of the icon set they're switching to in Windows. Here's a picture of that. They're also doing some new artwork for LibreOffice. They're doing new icons. I have never been a fan of the LibreOffice suite's icons. They just, I don't know, there's something about them. They're not that attractive, and they are somewhat confusing to look at. For example, this last grid here with 4 different icons. I mean, what are those? It's very hard, especially at smaller icon sizes, to tell the difference between the LibreOffice Writer icon and the LibreOffice Calc icon and the LibreOffice Presentation icon, etc., etc. So I really wish they would just come up with a completely new design for the icon set. Maybe they will eventually, but they have tweaked the icons a little bit. Better image handling. Now this is a big one. I often do use LibreOffice Writer and LibreOffice Presentation, and a lot of times I do put images in those documents, and sometimes things do not work as expected. It's a little wonky. So LibreOffice 6.1 features what they're calling reworked image handling using a new graphic manager. What this means is adding, managing, editing images in your documents should be faster and smoother, more reliable. Great. Love that. The notebook bar now complete for Writer. So the notebook bar is, I guess, LibreOffice, their ribbon interface. I've never used Microsoft Office's ribbon interface. I've never actually used notebook bar in LibreOffice Writer, but I do know it's kind of it's been their experimental kind of ribbon interface. But apparently now it is mature and complete. You go to View in the menu in LibreOffice Writer, and you can go to, I think, a layout, and you can choose the notebook bar layout. And basically what it does is it gets rid of a lot of extra clutter in LibreOffice Writer. It gets rid of a lot of the toolbars at the top and any sidebars. And now, for example, in this picture, they're showing you the tabbed notebook bar. You see the tabs at the top of that image, where you click the tab and you get a set of tools for that particular tab instead of just having a million different things on the page. So less distraction. It actually is not a bad project. I normally don't turn that on, though, the notebook bar. But for those of you that have been using it and love it, it's better than ever. Also, they have included more features as far as Amazon's next bestseller. So I guess it's using tools so you can publish documents using EPUB, which is a ebook format. For those of you that are trying to write the next New York Times bestseller, that stuff is even easier now. You can go ahead and publish straight away. And finally, in this particular article, little things that make life easier. Let's see, is anything worth noting? New field backgrounds and gradients, so more graphical improvements. Improvements to importing from Excel 2003. That's interesting. More docx export and import stuff. And of course, GTK3 improvements as far as how this looks in GTK3. And in this particular article, it does give us a download link. You can also get LibreOffice 6.1 as a flat pack if it is not already in your repos. I think there is also a PPA for those of you running Ubuntu. So that is LibreOffice 6.1. Check it out. All right, and the next story on the docket is going to be Winepak. Winepak makes it easier for you to run your Windows programs on your Linux installation. Now, this is actually going to be pretty incredible here. So you guys have heard of Flatpak, of course. Flatpak is these containerized packages that you can install on any Linux system. It is distro agnostic. Well, basically, they're going to start creating these Flatpak-like containers at SIP for programs, Windows programs, running in a Wine container. So this particular article over at Tech Republic, installing Windows apps on Linux is about to get easier with Winepak. Jack Wallen is the author of this article. He discusses how the installation of Windows apps will soon no longer be a barrier to entry thanks to Winepak. And I will read a little bit of this. If you've ever wanted to make the switch to Linux, but the idea of leaving behind Windows apps always seemed to be a stumbling block, you might know about Wine. Wine is, technically it's not an emulator, but most people think of it as an emulator. Wine is this, basically this environment that allows you to install and run Windows programs inside Linux. I have never liked Wine. When people ask me about Wine, I never recommend Wine. Why? Because Wine does not work for the most part. I break it down like this. In thirds. About a third of the programs you install in Wine, your Windows programs, about a third of them will work perfectly. Then you will have about a third of them will work, but it's buggy. It's missing functionality. Things are not quite right, but it does run at least. And then you have another third of your Windows programs that won't run at all in Wine. So Wine is a mixed bag. Some things work great, some things work okay, some things don't work at all in Wine. Wine is not a great option as far as a Windows replacement. That's why I always tell people, if you absolutely have to run a Windows only program, you know, for work or school, keep a copy of Windows around. Just keep a VM of Windows 10 around, or if you have to, dual boot Windows alongside Linux. I mean, you have to do what you have to do. Wine, though, is probably not a good option for you, but a lot of people do try it. In the early days, I did try it myself, ran a few programs in Wine, and that's why I know it doesn't work. And for the most part, other people tell me the same thing. I tried Wine for a little while, but you know what? It was so frustrating, I just gave up. And eventually, of course, living in Linux, you're going to just move over to free and open source alternatives anyway. You're going to just leave the Windows world behind. Now, it's been so many years since I've run any Windows programs. I don't miss anything because I don't even know what I'm missing because I live full-time in Linux now, have for many years. But a lot of you, especially just coming over, you still need to run your Windows programs. Winepak is going to be a game changer, I think, in this. Reading a little bit more of the article. How? Have you ever heard of Flatpak? If not, Flatpak provides a sandbox environment in which users can run applications in isolation from the rest of the system. Meaning they're containerized, right? You download this Winepak for whatever Windows program. We'll say Microsoft Office Word, for example. It installs Word in its own little container. It's sandbox from the rest of your installation. It doesn't affect anything else on your Linux install. So reading further, these applications are containerized, so you don't have to worry about dependencies. All the dependencies are also in this container, this Winepak. So no dependency hell where you have to go out and try to find all the dependencies. Are they available? Are they Windows only dependencies? Now you have to try to install them in Wine. You install the container, it runs. Simple as that. So Winepak makes it easier to create containerized Windows applications that are installable on Linux. And he gives a for instance, you wanted to install Notepad++. Why you would want to do that, I don't know. But for instance, you want to install Notepad++. With Winepak installed, it would take a little more than running a command sudo flatpak install Winepak and then the name of the program, which is org.notepad++.notepad++, the location of where that Winepak is out there on the web. The installation for these things, he mentions, will take some time because these containers, of course, are pulling down a Wine wrapper for these programs. So it's not only we've got to go pull down the code for Notepad++, but we also have to do this Wine wrapper around it. Again, it's all containerized. So these will not be the quickest things to install, but it's not like you're going to install 1 million of these Winepaks. Most people need 1 or 2 Windows programs, that they just have to have, when they first come over to Linux. So overall, I think Winepak is a great idea. Because one of the problems with Wine, I mentioned I don't like recommending people, try Wine is complicated. It's hard to set up. It's hard to get things working right. And Winepak should have everything squared away for you out of the box. If somebody creates a Winepak for something like Notepad++ or Microsoft Word or whatever, Windows Media Player or anything, it should just work, right? I mean, they created this Winepak. They've already got the dependencies set. They've already got the Wine wrapper set up exactly the way it should. It should just work. So in a lot of ways, this could be a game changer for those that have to run Windows-only programs. So good job. And the next story on the docket is the failure of desktop Linux. Has that been a good thing for Linux in the grand scheme of things? I recently came across this article and I thought, wow, I had actually never considered this. Has the fact that Linux has never gained traction on the desktop as far as the masses. We've never been able to get large numbers of people to convert to Linux on the desktop. Has it been a good thing for Linux in the long run? And it does make you think. This article over at Linux Journal, written by Glenn Moody, why the failure to conquer the desktop was great for GNU/Linux. And in this particular article, he focuses on Ubuntu in specific, and Canonical, the company behind Ubuntu. Canonical recently launched Ubuntu 18.04 LTS. It's an important release, in part because it's supported for 5 years, making it one of the relatively rare LTS products in Ubuntu's history. 18.04 also marks a high-profile return to GNOME as the default desktop. So, a lot of good desktop news, right? After a few controversial years of experimentation with the Unity desktop and all this desktop stuff, which those of us that run desktop Linux would be interested in. Then he goes on to mention that when you read the release announcements for 18.04 LTS, you read a bunch of stuff about cloud computing. It's all about the cloud. For example, a quote from the release announcement: "Multi-cloud operations are the new normal. Boot time and performance optimized images of Ubuntu 18.04 LTS on every major public cloud make it the fastest and most efficient OS for cloud computing, especially for storage and compute-intensive tasks like machine learning." They're really touting this stuff, right? They don't mention anything about, hey, we just switched from Unity to GNOME. You guys might care about that. No, they're not interested in Linux on the desktop. At least that is not their primary focus. Is that a good thing? It may be in the long run. For example, in the article here, Glenn Moody writes, Ubuntu claims to be the standard OS for cloud computing, citing research that shows 70% of public cloud workloads and 54% of OpenStack clouds use Ubuntu. Since Canonical is a privately held company, it doesn't publish a detailed breakdown of its operations, just a basic summary, yada yada yada. Anyway, Canonical is huge as far as cloud computing. They are making a lot of money now in the server market, and especially the cloud server industry. Why? Because that is what they're focused on. They realized they were never going to convert the masses over to Ubuntu on the desktop. Linux on the desktop, I think they, after a decade of trying it, they knew it was never going to happen. Where was the money to be made? Well, Red Hat is making billions in the server market. In the enterprise industry, they also, Canonical, wanted to get into some of that, but you know what? Red Hat is already a major player in that field, so they really went all in on cloud, and it is it's paying dividends for them right now. Canonical is doing really good things in the cloud market. Reading ahead, Glenn Moody interviewed Shuttleworth back in 2008. Mark Shuttleworth is the CEO and founder of Canonical and Ubuntu. He asked Mark Shuttleworth what the #1 challenge for making the Linux desktop something that you want to keep on your computer, and in truth, Canonical was forced to try something else because it was clear GNU/Linux was never going to take off on the desktop, despite all the hopes for those of us in the open source community that, year after year we keep saying, this is the year. This is the year of Linux on the desktop. This is going to be our year. It's not happened yet, and at this point it's never going to happen, because really PC computing is on its way down. With the rise of mobile, desktop computing, it's not dead. I don't think it's ever going to be dead, but it's never going to be what it was. And this is the interesting thing, because desktop computing is never going to be what it once was. Microsoft is having to change their tune. For example, Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella, he recently wrote a letter to all his employees titled "Embracing Our Future, Intelligent Cloud and Intelligent Edge." So much like Canonical, although way late to the game is Microsoft, they're betting on cloud offerings. Of course, they're doing their Microsoft Azure servers. But again, Microsoft is just now getting into this. Too late, Microsoft. You let other people, much like Microsoft, had the desktop wrapped up, way ahead of everybody else as far as, our open source alternatives like Linux and BSD and whatnot. They're getting into the cloud game way too late. Canonical already owns that space. Microsoft would like a piece of that pie. I don't think it's going to work out for them. Originally, Microsoft, their plans were to have over 1 billion devices running Windows 10 in 2018. They're going to come way short of that. Windows just recently hit 600 million devices worldwide. So no way they're getting to 1 billion ever. So clearly, Steam is running out as far as desktop computing. The PC platform is just never going to be what it was. Mobile is where people do most of their personal computing now. And of course, as far as these big computer companies, where is the money to be made? Server market, in the cloud industry, Internet of Things, all these new technologies that are coming out. AI is going to be the next big one. And Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, he really wants to get into AI. But for a lot of the same reasons that cloud computing, everybody is going to open source alternatives, things like Ubuntu and other GNU/Linux distros for cloud computing. Same thing with AI. They're not going to go with Microsoft for AI. AI shares a lot of the same characteristics as supercomputing, reading a little bit more of the article, which is interesting because one of the big things you hear from Linux enthusiasts all the time is that we just completely own the supercomputer industry. The top 5 most powerful computers in the world all run Linux. Think about that. The top 5 fastest computers, the top 500 supercomputers in the world, all run Linux. Not a single other operating system runs on any of the top 500 supercomputers. AI is going to be very similar. It's all going to be Linux. It's all going to be open sourced. Microsoft is not going to make inroads into that market. Again, Microsoft is kind of pivoting. Maybe eventually Microsoft will pivot to the point where they actually do some open source operating systems of their own, maybe even their own Linux distros. That's probably what they're going to have to do to ever really compete in these markets. But right now, most of this particular article by Glenn Moody here over at Linux Journal was about how Ubuntu is really doing big things and starting to make a lot of money. Probably soon they're going to do an IPO, initial public offering, and go public, and they're just going to make bucket loads of money. And a lot of this has been because Linux on the desktop is never going to happen. Has it been a good thing for GNU/Linux in the long run? Yes, because a lot of these other areas where we just dominate. I mean, we love to talk about how Linux is not a failure because we're on all these other devices. Think about all the billions of mobile devices we're on routers and all these, small devices. Think about, how we dominate the web server market, the cloud server market, and the supercomputing market. Would we have ever focused on any of that had Linux on the desktop worked out from the beginning? No. So anyway, I thought this article was interesting. It does give you something to think on. And the 4th story on the docket, 5 reasons why i3 is better than your current desktop environment. Now, this could be a little bit controversial, but you know what? I thought this was an interesting article I came across over at opensource.com. 5 reasons the i3 window manager makes Linux better. Get started with the keystroke-driven i3 tiling window manager for the Linux desktop. A lot of people ask me about tiling window managers in general and about i3 in specific. Why should I run i3? Well, i3 is not for everybody. But there are some things that a tiling window manager like i3 definitely do better than a standard floating window manager. Things like, GNOME, KDE, XFCE. So reading a little bit of this article, by the way, was written by Riccardo Girardi. I guess he works at Red Hat. Very cool. One of the nicest things about Linux and open source software in general is the freedom to choose among different alternatives to address our needs. I've been using Linux for a long time, but I was never entirely happy with the desktop environment options available. I can relate. I was never happy with the big desktop environments either. That's why very early on in my desktop Linux career, I found OpenBox, and I never went back to things like KDE and GNOME. OpenBox, very minimal floating window manager, not a tiling window manager. He's talking about tiling window managers today. He mentions he found i3, which was an amazing piece of software that changed his life. I can relate. OpenBox changed my life. i3 is a tiling window manager. The goal of the window manager is to control the appearance and placements of windows in a windowing system. So basically, every time you open a program on your desktop, for those that aren't familiar with what a window manager actually is, when you open a window, the border, the frame around the window, the controls at the top of the window, that is the window manager. It is actually what controls how that window, that program looks in a window and where it's placed on the screen and how it acts when you drag it around with the mouse or hit keyboard combinations to move it around. A window manager manages your window. All right, so 5 reasons why you might switch to something like i3. Here's number 1 reason: minimalism. i3 is fast. It's not bloated. It's not fancy, but it's simple and efficient. And I agree. A lot of these minimal window managers, and he's going to keep mentioning i3. I don't use i3 myself. I use Qtile. I've used Xmonad, both tiling window managers, the same as him. Even floating window managers, minimal floating window managers like OpenBox, Fluxbox, JWM could also be applied to this. They're minimal because they're simple, they're efficient, there's not much to them. You know, you download and install some of these window managers. I mean, like the OpenBox window manager, the install is one program, no dependencies, and it takes about 3 seconds. Sudo apt install OpenBox, in 3 seconds it's there. So very minimal. Big plus when you install full desktop environments like GNOME and KDE. It could take an hour to pull down everything, especially if you're installing all the GNOME apps, all the KDE apps, their entire suite of apps, all the dependencies for all these things. You know, it's very much serving you a full desktop environment that you didn't create, you know, and you had no part in. You didn't pick every single piece of every, you know, things like i3 are for those people that really want to build their system from the ground up, starting with the window manager. I'm going to go with i3, for instance. Now, do I want a panel? Well, if I want a panel or a dock, I need to decide which one I want to go with. What programs do I want to run inside i3? What file manager do I want to run? What web browser do I want to run? You're going to get web browsers and file managers and terminal emulators when you install GNOME and KDE because they have their own of those sorts of programs. You're going to get, for example, in KDE, the Dolphin file manager. You're going to get Console for a terminal emulator. You don't get any of that stuff with these minimal window managers. You get to decide exactly what programs you install and want to run. Number 2 in his list is screen real estate. For tiling window managers, you get more screen real estate. There is no wasted screen because i3, for example, it automatically tiles and positions the windows in a non-overlapping way, meaning windows do not stack on top of each other. You always see every window. They're always available, which means i3 in general makes better use of your screen real estate. It allows you to get what you need done faster. It also mentions his third of 5 points why i3 might be better for you is keyboard-driven workflow. This is not for everybody. Some people hate the keyboard. Some people are much better at the mouse. Point and click is all they want to do, and that's fine. The mouse, though, I will tell you, if you can get away from it, it will help you. You will be much more efficient if you learn to use the keyboard. Also, it's better for your wrists. I hate having my hand on that mouse all the time and dragging it around. It really can, you know, hurt your wrist and give you some damage. Keyboard driven stuff, if you can type, I mean, if you can type on the keyboard, this stuff is not that hard to learn. i3, he mentions, makes exhaustive use of keyboard shortcuts to control different aspects of your environment. They include opening the terminal and other programs, resizing and positioning your windows, changing layouts, even shutting down i3, exiting out of i3, rebooting your computer, whatever. You can have keyboard shortcuts for all of that stuff. So you never need to grab the mouse for anything. I have a window open and I want to close it. There's a keyboard combination to close that window. I want to open up a different program. There's a keyboard combination to open that other program I want to open. I want to shut down i3, log out, maybe log into a different window manager. I'll have a keyboard combination that kills i3 and sends me back to my display manager where I can log into a different window manager if I want. Number 4 in his list, flexibility. i3 strives to be minimal and use few system resources. So i3, again, light and minimal. So he's going back to the minimal thing. But it does allow you some flexibility because there's nothing installed with i3, you know, no extra cruft. So you get to choose, you know, for example, he mentions, how do you define a background on your desktop? Are you going to use FEH? Are you going to use nitrogen? How are you going to set a wallpaper? That's up to you. Are you going to use compositing? Something like Compton, for example, to add window effects, fading, and transparency. If you want to, great. If you don't want to, up to you. Do you want to use some kind of program launcher like dmenu or Rofi or Synapse or, you know, a million others of these sorts of programs that are available to you, or not use any of them at all? Up to you. So flexibility. And his 5th reason why i3 makes Linux a little better, workspaces. And i3, a workspace, is an easy way to group windows. You can group them in different ways according to your workflow. yada, yada, yada. You guys probably know how these virtual workspaces work. For example, in i3, I can set, 8 different virtual workspaces, and I can have, I have 3 monitors. Monitor 1 can be workspace 1, monitor 2 can be workspace 3, or monitor 2 can be workspace 2, monitor 3 can be workspace 3. And then I also have 5 other virtual workspaces where I can switch monitor 1, workspace 1 to workspace 4, and yada, yada, yada. All done with the keyboard. No clicking anything with the mouse. So, just a little bit, because I do get, especially a lot of newer to Linux users, they hear about i3 in particular a lot because the Arch guys really tout i3. I do a lot of tiling window manager stuff on my channel. I don't run i3 that much, but people keep asking me, hey, I'm running GNOME or XFCE or whatever, and I keep hearing about i3. I'd like to give it a try, but I mean, what's the point? Why should I try i3? Well, I'm going to have a link to this particular article in the show's description. Check it out. And the 5th and final story on the docket today is about Snapchat. Snapchat recently had some of their source code leaked online, and somebody archived it over at GitHub. And the Snapchat folks were not real happy about that. Anyway, reading this particular article over at Motherboard, who wrote this article? Joseph Cox. Snapchat source code leaked and posted to GitHub. Snap confirmed to Motherboard that an iOS update recently exposed some of the company's code. So there was an iOS update, somehow it exposed some of their source code. Hackers, of course, took this source code. They put it up on GitHub for everybody to see. GitHub is often the go-to place for hackers or researchers to archive interesting code or data dumps. That's interesting. I think that is a little bit overblown that GitHub is a place for hackers. I agree it's a place for researchers, but anyway, maybe a little slanderous toward GitHub. Anyway, earlier this year, Snap, the company behind the social media network Snapchat, exposed some of the source code of the network's iOS app. Snap confirmed to Motherboard on Tuesday. After someone archived the exposed code on GitHub, Snap told GitHub to remove the data with a Copyright Act request. So, the Snapchat guys realized, hey, this code leaked. Somebody put it on GitHub. They requested GitHub take it down. Now, apparently they didn't get a quick response from GitHub as far as GitHub just didn't take the code down because, I mean, they have to investigate the matter a little bit, right? So, apparently, one of the responses they got initially was the GitHub guys, well, what is the best solution for this alleged infringement? Are there specific changes that the other person can make other than removal? Meaning, hey, this person posted this code on GitHub. We're not just going to remove it. Is there anything he can change to make it, not as much of an infringement as it is? And the Snapchat guys did not respond well to that. They basically said, no, it should be removed. The whole thing should be removed. It's leaked source code. We did not give this guy this source code. It's proprietary. We didn't give him permission to put it on GitHub. And they basically filed a Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA, which is a law that businesses often use to protect their intellectual property. You do an MCA request, and usually what happens is the site pretty much has to take down the content. One of the GitHub repos previously hosting the Snapchat code now says we have disabled public access to this repository. So GitHub did have to take that code down, but that is interesting that, Snapchat, the code was leaked, although to be honest, it seems like it was partly their fault. They weren't handling that iOS update correctly. And we have seen this stuff before with this proprietary code for some of these large companies that accidentally get leaked through negligence of their own. Apple had a situation like this a while back, I remember, and some of their code was posted online. Anyway, I won't, feel sorry for them too much. Snapchat, again, proprietary company, proprietary code, and they're making a lot of money. Some of it got leaked online. Boo-hoo. And that is the 5th and final story for this particular episode of Taking Into Account. This was episode 3. Again, I'm going to try to release a new episode of Taking Into Account every Thursday. That is my goal, is to make this a weekly show released every Thursday. Last week's episode, other than the 5 stories I covered last week, at the end I also covered a viewer question. I covered, somebody sent me a question via either email or on Mastodon, and I read that and answered it in video on last week's episode, and a lot of you guys said that was a great addition to the show, so I'm going to do that again this week. So I'm going to go to my Mastodon page here, and a lot of you guys have signed up over on Mastodon because I've done some videos on Mastodon recently, and I asked you guys to come over and hang out with me on Mastodon. A lot of you guys have. You've sent me a lot of good questions over at Mastodon. Now, one was a guy was looking for Linux news. You know, where do you go for your Linux news? And I posted this over on Mastodon, this list here. Matter of fact, I will post this entire list in the show description. But I gave him, of course, Linux.com. Linux.com is a fantastic resource for Linux news. News for the open source professional. So you got news, tutorials, basically learning, some community stuff, forums, blogs, various resources. Linux.com is fantastic. I also suggested opensource.com. One of the stories I actually covered in this evening's episode, I found over on opensource.com. A lot of articles, resources, download links for various things. Opensource.com, fantastic. OMG Ubuntu, I think all of you guys probably know OMG Ubuntu. One of the more popular, you know, Linux blogs out there. It's where I did my LibreOffice story from this evening. Other things you might be interested in were things like It's False. It's False. Not a bad little blog. Some good information there. LXER.com is good. Phoronix, Softpedia, TechMint, LWN.net, Linux Insider, Hacker News, Network World, Datamation, and I even included alltop.com/Linux, which is basically one page where they aggregate some Linux news from various other sources. Anyway, again, I will link to all those sites that I posted to that particular guy's question over on Mastodon. By the way, that was Randomizer that asked me that over on Mastodon. Thank you, Randomizer. And that is this week's Taking Into Account. Before I go, of course, I do need to give a special thanks to all my patrons, all my Patreon supporters. I'm talking about A.K. Allen, Alex, Ansem, Tony, Bart, Benjamin, Ben, Bruno, Brian, Carlos, Christian, Chuck, Dan, the other Dan, Daniel, David, the other David, Eduardo, Greg, Humate, Interceptor, Jake, John, Carl, Katrina, Keith, Leor, Marcus, the other Marcus, Matt, Mark, Martin, Matthias, Michael, Mr. GFY, Mr. Smarty Pants, Mr. Neely Pops, Paul, Rob, Robert, Ron, Silvio, Steven, the other Steven, and yet another Steven, Swami, Tiedemann, Voislav, Tubella, and John. You guys rock. You guys help make this show possible. Peace, guys.